You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments below, and be sure to smash that like button. All right, with the traditional February signing date in the rearview mirror, good opportunity to call on our guy Sam Spiegelman, national recruiting analyst for On3. He's on Twitter at Sam Spiegs. Sam, we appreciate you, man. How are you?
Oh, I can't complain. How you guys doing?
Doing really well, man. I think Brian Kelly and his staff doing pretty well after polishing off the class the way they did. A general thought on what Kelly was able to do here in his third class at LSU?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit cliche, Matt. We've had this discussion in the past with all the different coaches that have come through LSU, but I think it goes worth pointing out that in the NIL era, in the transfer portal era, LSU is signing a top 10 class, and it's full of the Louisiana kids that, all the fans want, all the coaches want. At different points in this cycle, it has not always looked this bright. They kind of took advantage of Jimbo Fisher getting fired in Texas A&M. They went elsewhere in the country and kind of took away from Deion Sanders' momentum early in this recruiting cycle. But they end up finishing with a top 10 class. They have multiple 5-stars, multiple guys in this, in the top 100 in On3's ranking. A lot of guys that at one point were either leaning or committed to their rivals. I think that the way that they've locked down the state and still managed to put together a nationally relevant class, I think speaks a lot for BK and not only the staff that's been there, but a lot of their new additions as well.
Sam, how close was LSU with Terry Bussey, as best you can tell?
It was very close, Matt. Having this discussion with other media members, people connected to this recruitment. I mean, there's not been a lot of recruitments that have I think when people say it's 50-50 and it could have went either way, I think there was enough optimism that if he picked LSU, I wouldn't have been surprised. I think the only one that would have surprised me would have been Georgia, considering that a week, days after, getting back from Baton Rouge, it seemed like Georgia had kind of fallen out of the race, even though Kirby Smart went to Timpson to go try to change the 5-stars' mind. But listen, Timpson, right on the border of Texas and Louisiana. He was a longtime A&M lean, but of course that staff got fired. You have to really credit what Elko and the new DB coach Ishmael Artiside did. They were part of Terry's recruitment during their first stint at A&M. They recruited him a little bit at Duke and really turned up the heat when they arrived. And LSU also had to overcome the fact that Kerry Cooks, who was Terry's lead recruiter, is obviously not a part of the staff. Corey Raymond did a really fantastic job of kind of selling Terry on obviously competing for playing time day one. Frank Wilson was a big part of this recruitment. Sherman Wilson, the new DC, Blake Baker, was a big part of this recruitment. And I think, he had a lot of LSU fans in his corner, in his circle. That's why I would say LSU finished second before the Aggies in September. They got him back on campus a few weeks later, and then that midweek unofficial, it was as close as you get, but, he's still a Texas kid and top priority for that staff.
Sam Spiegelman's our guest, national recruiting analyst for On3. What SEC school made a splash in this recruiting cycle? Sam, not just with the February finish, but just the cycle as a whole now that it's finished?
I think Auburn made a pretty good splash. Auburn kind of beat Alabama on a couple of guys. They beat Georgia on a couple of guys. And we're talking about how close LSU was with Terry Bussey. Auburn was pretty close with Ryan Williams, who ended up going back to Alabama in the end. They nearly flipped KJ Bolden, who obviously ended up at Georgia, and Georgia put together, obviously, the number one class in the country. I don't know if it's a surprise, because that's kind of what's expected for Kirby, and probably will be the short-term expectation now that Nick Saban has hanged up his cleats. But I think Hugh Freeze was a fantastic recruiter at Ole Miss. Now that he's at Auburn, I mean, there's a high expectation there, especially now that Nick Saban is not at Alabama. I think he started to take advantage, especially, they need help on both sides of the ball. That roster wasn't where it needed to be. And in the NIL era and the opportunity to tell highly regarded, future freshmen that they could come in and compete for playing time early, that's usually a pretty good formula for jump-starting the engine, and I think that's what Hugh Freeze did a little bit.
Of course, Freeze is going into year 2 at Auburn. I'm curious, Sam, the early returns on the new coaches in the conference. You mentioned Elko a little bit. Kalen DeBoer obviously getting his first taste. What have been the early returns for the new coaches in the league?
Yeah, I think Mike Elko is making a really big splash in the state of Texas. Not that Jimbo Fisher didn't carry a lot of weight when he arrived in College Station, but I think with the emergence of the Longhorns, with Brent Venables turning things around at Oklahoma pretty quickly, I think, and the obvious growing pressure on Jimbo Fisher, I think among kids notice that they pay attention to the same things that we all do. And they felt, that A&M had talent on that roster. A&M has won some colossal national and regional recruitments over the past, half decade under Jimbo Fisher. They have 5 stars up and down, even though half of them left in the transfer portal recently. There's still a ton of future NFL players on that roster. So I think the Elko coming in, I think he's brought a real professional approach. I think obviously that's what helped him succeed at Duke. And I think that's what has really, resonated with coaches, with kids around the country. And Kalen DeBoer, I was in San Antonio, I guess it was last month, it all kind of molds together. But, it was asking kids what they thought about Washington and Michigan playing in the national championship. And, everyone kind of knows the brand of Michigan. It's a storied program. Jim Harbaugh is obviously a polarizing guy, but people talking about Washington, the quarterback, the wealth of receivers, the offense being a spread offense, obviously more modernized, I would say, under Kalen DeBoer. I don't think I've ever had conversations with recruits about Washington on that level of stage. Those are all blue chip recruits talking about what he was doing at Washington, and now he's at Alabama, which, like we said earlier, Nick Saban is no longer there. You don't have bigger shoes to fill, but it feels like Alabama got a really splashy hire from people who know a lot more than me and kids that are going to be playing on very big stages soon enough. So I'm really interested personally to see what he does there. I think, he has all the tools to be successful. I don't know if anyone can ever reach the same mountaintop that Nick Saban did, but sure. I think Alabama found a very capable coach who is probably going to succeed based on his resume.
Sam, before you go, maybe a few bullet points nationally. Obviously, by the way, I guess I should mention there is another new coach in the league in Jeff Lebby. But they're not even the most interesting story in their own state, so we could bypass what Mississippi State did. But nationally, if you were to give me, you just mentioned Washington there, but maybe 2 or 3 bullet points nationally from this recruiting cycle that are the biggest headlines. What would you say were the things that stood out the most?
Well, in terms of players, I think it's impossible to ignore the NIL factor and transfer portal impact on high school recruiting. But I think there's, what stands out to me is the number 1 player in the country is Jeremiah Smith, who, again, it involves how good of a player he is. Our director of scouting, Charles Power, gave I thought, a very apt comparison with him and Cam Coleman, who's another top 4 player of Julio Jones and A.J. Green back in the day. And I think Jeremiah Smith is that dude, and Ohio State had to hold off a NIL-related, down to the wire recruiting battle. We talked about Terry Bussey being conflicted. Florida State was in the mix. Miami was in the mix. They're talking about a kid waiting till the 23rd hour of the day to get in his papers. And of course, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. But in terms of talent, that's the kind of talent that we're talking about goes into Ohio State, who is already a loaded roster and makes an impact. And then nationally, I think we also talk about DJ Lagway. That was also a very polarizing recruitment. It also, again, someone that I was pretty close to in his recruitment from the time he was a sophomore over at Willis, and he committed to Florida in December after his junior season. So think about just what he accomplished on the field. I think that's the kind of talent that, fans of Florida are waiting for to come to the Swamp. So, and with all the mounting pressure on Billy Napier, I'm really curious to see how this goes. But in terms of the NIL, you had Lincoln Riley, you had Mike Elko, you had Dabo Sweeney calling on National Signing Day Eve back in December to see how this recruitment was going. The NIL factor was, of course, a part of it. But just to show you for LSU fans coming up, the Bryce Underwood committing in January, the recruitment's not over. These recruitments have gone to a whole different level.
Sure.
Each one is different. Each one is a chameleon. But NIL and elite talent, all kind of big headlines of this 2024 class.
And that certainly is not going anywhere, ever.
No, not at all.
Sam Spiegelman is our guest, national recruiting analyst for On3. He's on Twitter at Sam Spiegs. We appreciate it, man, as always. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, guys.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.